The data grid is a .NET 1 control. It still works. The grid view is a bit more functionality to it. So we'll use an ASP grid view. We'll give it an ID. Call it GRD students. And we'll set the run at equals server attribute. We'll need to add some other stuff to this eventually, but for now this should give us the raw grid. So now we need to get our application connected up to our database, and we're going to look at what the entity framework does, how it's going to auto-build stuff for us. So the first thing you'll want to do, I don't know if you have this Server Explorer tab here. If you don't see Server Explorer on the left, you can enable that through the View menu. Click on View and Server Explorer, and that'll make that window available. Now my application, my Visual Studio is already wired up to connect to my Azure database. Yours probably isn't. So if you expand Azure under SQL databases, you may not have anything here. If not, I'll show you how to add the connection. You'll probably need to do this. So to add it, if you just right-click Azure, do you see an option there that says Add Data Connection or Connect to Microsoft Azure subscription?
I see Connect, and I see the same thing you're seeing. Mine's different.
So what options do you get when you right-click Azure? Import and manage, that's it?
So refresh and open SQL Server Object Explorer.
Well, no, you didn't.
There's data connections, I can do that.
Yeah, go to Data Connection. Right-click and choose Add Connection. We'll try it this way. And once you choose Add Connection, it's going to prompt you for the information. So you'll have to choose the database type as SQL Server. So the first thing you'll choose is SQL Server, so you'll get this box. Choose Microsoft SQL Server. Say OK. Put in your server name on Azure. Please choose Use SQL Server Authentication. Enter the username and password that you've written down. Say it. And then once you've put in your login, this box where it says connect to a database will become enabled, and you type your database name in here. So you supply the server name, your username, password, and the database name, and click OK.
You just hit the drop down.
Or you can hit the drop down, yep. So now Visual Studio can see your database. So you actually, and some of you have discovered this already. I think, Ben, you already discovered this. You're already working within Visual Studio. So in here, if I click oh, okay, I do have to go. I don't tend to manage my database through Visual Studio because it doesn't have all the functionality of Management Studio, but if you want to use it, you can actually manage it right through here. So I can go into Visual Studio. Here's my COMP2000. So I can create queries. I can look at the tables. I can code stored procedures, change my tables. You can do all of this through Visual Studio if you like. So it's kind of a mini version of Management Studio baked into Visual Studio.
SQL Server Object Explorer.
Don't you need to download that?
I right-clicked my database and I chose Open an SQL Server Object Explorer.
Yeah, mine says browse.
Yeah, it's browse.
Oh, incompatible SQL Server version.
I had to download an extra thing at home to do it.
Okay. So there may be an add-on that's not installed on the lab computers, which is fine. We have Management Studio. We can connect through Management Studio. It's got richer functionality anyway. So now we're going to go through using the entity framework. Notice Visual Studio automatically created this folder called Models. So I'm going to right-click on the Models folder, choose Add, New Item, and now the item we want is not in the Web tab. So far, all the things we've been adding, master pages, web forms, user controls, they're all in the Web section. What we want is under the Data tab. So the second section says Data, and the first thing we want is an ADO.NET Entity Data Model. So we're using Entity Framework. I'm just going to call this Contoso Model. Under Data, yeah, if your debugger's active, you can't make changes. So again, I'll walk through that again. Right-click the Models folder, choose Add New Item, click on Data under Visual C#. We want an ADO.NET Entity Data Model. So we're going to let Visual Studio generate a model from our existing database. So I'll call it Contoso Model. So now we've got a bunch of choices. Now I have 4 in mind because I have some add-ons that you might be missing. So what we want, what options do you have if you have 2?
Generate from database.
So pick Generate from Database. And I'm going to pick EF Designer from Database. And choose Next.
Include sensitive data.
So now it's asking what connection do you want to use. If you already have a connection, you can pick the connection you just created. I have to set mine up. So I'll just grab my server name. And enter my credentials. I'm going to save the password and choose my COMP2007 database.
I can't connect.
And now you'll have a couple choices. I'm going to say include the sensitive data in the connection string. And it's going to save this connection string in web.config. It'll give it a name. So in this case, it's called COMP2007 entities. We could change that name if we want. I'm just going to leave the name that gets generated. So it will add the database connection to our web.config for us. We don't even have to write the connection string. Visual Studio will do it for us. Which version? I'm not sure. I think you guys have both versions. We may as well use 6. We'll use the newest version. That tutorial series we looked at earlier was using Entity Framework 5, but a lot of the things are similar. So now it's trying to connect to the database, and it says, okay, here's all the objects in the database, tables, views, stored procedures. Which of these things do you want to include in the model? So I'm just going to click on tables and choose all 4 tables. So we can build different models. If we have a huge database, we can compartmentalize it and build different models, each with a certain subset of tables that are related. We don't have to include everything in one model if our database is too big. I'll leave these defaults. So the model namespace is COMP2007 model. I'll just leave this as the default. So just make sure the 4 tables are checked. And when I click Finish, Visual Studio is going to build out a model from the database. Yep.
I can't add a data connection.
What do the errors say?
Unable to add data connection, cannot load file or assembly, and some wibbly wobbly stuff.
Okay, I'll have to have a look at it, Brad. So this is going to take a minute. It's going to add references to the entity framework to the solution, which are quite big. The library, entity framework libraries are quite large. And then it's going to generate a visual model for us of the database. It's also going to auto-generate all of the model classes with the properties and the data relations.
Oh, that's awesome.
So again, we could do this. We could code that. If we wanted to take the code first model, we could write the classes ourselves and push them to an empty database, or we could take our database and go the other way.
It's much faster.
It's much faster if we already have a database.
Correct.
So it builds this out. We can see the relationships between the models. And if I go into Solution Explorer, so it added 2 entity framework references. And inside of the model, so it creates this as an EDMX file. It's basically, it's like, so it's a class diagram that shows the business classes and the relationships. It also built out these files: course, department, enrollment, and student. Now it does something funky. It thought the ES on the end of course was for pluralizing, so it chopped off our E, which is bugging me. So I'm just going to click where it says course and put an E back in there. I want my model to be called course spelled properly. So when I'll hit enter, I'm going to save my model. And I think it's going to ask if we want to update the class to also be renamed to course with an E. It just does it automatically, right? So if we open up one of these, so here's our student class. Auto-generated by the entity framework. We get a public class with 4 public properties, our get and set methods, as well as a link because one student is enrolled in many classes, so it gives us a collection for our association, one student to many enrollments. So before Entity Framework came along, if we were going to build this application, we'd probably have classes like this, except guess where those classes would come from? Right, we'd be typing them. And if you like doing this model, if you prefer to start here, you like thinking about your application from the perspective of what are the business objects, what do they look like, you can start with this. And you actually have the code first model where you build these classes and push them to the database. Or you have the model first where you can actually create your own model this way, and Visual Studio will generate the classes, and then you can push them to generate the tables in your database. So you can basically go in any direction. You can start either with the visual model, you can start with the coding your own classes, or you can start with the database tables. So the entity framework handles all of the mapping between our models and the database. Now notice these classes are auto-generated, so it's probably not a good idea for us to change them. So what happens, let's say we need to add a new column to our database. That column isn't in our model, right? It's not in our visual model. It's not in our class file. So what would we do if we go in and change the database because we either want to change the data type or we've got to add a column? How are we going to get that column in here if this stuff's auto-generated?
We have to remake it again?
Basically, we've got an option. We would just make our change, save it in our database. We could come into our visual model, right-click, and we can update the model from the database. It'll use our connection. It'll search for any changes. It'll regenerate the model, and then let us regenerate all the class files.
Just on the connection setting, you pick Microsoft SQL Server?
Yes. Right? Because there's Oracle library, there's a MySQL library, there's other types. We can also go the other way. We could make changes in the model, save changes in the visual model, then we can choose Generate Database from Model, and it'll rebuild our database. The only problem is we don't want to do this if we already have data in there, right? This will basically drop our tables and recreate them according to the new schema in the model. So we don't want to do that if we have existing data, or we're going to lose it. So we're going to keep that there, and now we can use these classes. So notice we've got 4 classes: course, department, enrollment. We also have one called Contoso Model. This is auto-generated. Actually, sorry, this is the one I wanted to show you. There's one called Contoso Model.context. This basically handles our database connections for us. So here's what it does. It's of type DB context. So this is a built-in class in the entity framework. It uses our connection string from web.config, and it sets out data sets for our 4 classes. So all of this is auto-generated, and if I open up web.config, we'll now have a database connection string. So here's my connection string called COMP2000 entities, and it points to my server on Azure, my COMP2007 database with my user ID. So that is what that's what handles our database interaction. So we don't manually have to do connection to do connecting, disconnecting, querying, etc. All of that stuff is auto-generated and handled through Entity Framework. Now, there's a good news, bad news scenario with this thing. The good news is it saves us a ton of time, right? All this stuff's automatically done. It's pre-built for us, so we can get down to the nuts and bolts of actually building the application. The bad news is, because so much is done automatically, if we run into problems, it's not as easy to debug. When you write all the lines of code yourself, it's easier to find and fix. The other thing is it can be harder to understand what's going on because the Entity Framework automates so much stuff. Okay, so there's a good deal of, as Jarrett likes to call it, auto magic, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff that's happening under the hood that we don't necessarily have granular control over. And at times when our application is doing things we don't understand, it's harder for us. You guys doing origami over there? All right, we'll make something cool. So we've got our grid view on our students page. Now I'm going to recompile my solution so that all of the model classes, the DB context, all that stuff gets added to the DLL. Our DLL should be a fair bit bigger now. So when we go to the students page, we'll have this grid, but nothing's going to show up yet. We haven't bound that grid to any data. Right, so we've got our heading. Our grid view doesn't show up because it's empty.
At the bottom there, it's a Visual Studio sort of work.
Oh, this is a little helpful toolbar. You can install this. It shows you unused CSS classes. This is part of the Visual Studio Web Essentials. It's an add-on. You need to have, I think you need to have update 4 of Visual Studio 2013 as a prerequisite for it. So once you install update 4, this is a pretty neat.
I think it's 3, because I remember.
Okay, is it? It could be. Thanks. You know what? It should. I would have thought somewhere on here it would tell us the system requirements, but maybe not. Yeah, does it have the system requirements? Well, that's for update 4. Okay, so it's a handy tool.
And it's third party, is it?
I'm not sure.
Seventh party?
Visual Studio make Web Essentials?
Yeah, I think they do. So I'm going to go into the code window. So what we want is to create a function that will query, use our student model to query the student table, fetch the list of students into memory, and then we can bind that result to our data grid. So I'll create a protected method called getStudents. And when our page loads, we want to say, if our page has not posted back, call getStudents. So, so if loading the page for the first time, populate the student grid. So now we're going to use the entity framework and our student model to connect to the database, get the list, and we'll need to use the link query syntax, which is new. It'll take a little while to get used to.
Using link.
Whoops. We have to add a few references here, up at the top. The entity framework models aren't available by default. So we're going to make a reference to the models. And we also want to make a reference to the model binding class. Might be a good idea to follow along. So we need these two references in order to be able to talk to the entity framework. So this is the name of your project, whatever you called your project, .models. So if your project name's different from mine, you'll need your project name.
System.web model binding?
And system.web.model binding, yep. What did we call it? So this is going to be whatever you have here, whatever your connection string is called. And we can also find it here in your web.config. So whatever the name of your connection string is, that's what we want to use. Whoops, sorry, that's supposed to go there. Sorry. My using syntax isn't so good. I'll make that mistake for the next 3 months. So we'll create a variable called DB that just uses our existing entity connection. So here we'll use our link syntax. So instead of writing an SQL query, we'll use link. Whoops. So S is just a variable.
Very new.
So we're going to query our student model. It is weird. So basically what this will run under the hood is the query, the SQL command select star from students. And we're just storing the result in a variable. So we'll query the students table using entity framework and link. And then we'll want to take that result and connect it up to the grid view. So we just convert our student object. Notice students is of type iQueryable. We'll use that a lot. It's basically just a collection. So whenever we have a list of data, it will inherit, use that interface. And then we just call grd students.databind. So use the entity framework, reference our student's model, run a select query, store the results, and then dump those results into our grid. So we don't need a loop. We don't have to specify the individual columns.
Nice.
What was that last one? Oh, there it is.
So if we reload the application and try the students page again, it should fill our grid. Although we're going to want to do some customizing with it. So there's our not so great looking grid, but it's functional. So let's do a few things with this. Well, what suggestions do you have for improving our grid? Okay, we can put in spacing. Yeah, we can use CSS. What about the enrollment date?
Formatting
Yeah, we might want to format that. How would you format it?
to an actual name month.
Okay, yeah, we could do that. We probably also can chop off the time. I don't think the enrollment time is very critical. So let's go ahead and make some changes in the... So in the grid view, the first thing I'm going to do is apply a CSS class. So I'll apply table striped. That should make it wider, give it alternating background colors. That's better. Table, space, table striped.
Oh, that's amazing.
Actually, we also can add, beside that, table dash hover. That'll also give us the rollover effect as the user moves the mouse up and down the table. It will highlight. It doesn't matter if it doesn't show up, it still works. So I've also added table hover, so now I get this effect, right? It highlights.
I've not seen
It's because of the lighting.
That effect, yes.
So I'm using both of those classes.
Oh.
Oh, it's cool. It actually does. It's very cool.
Now, by default, our grid view has a property called auto-generate columns. By default, that property is set to true. So it just spits out the columns. The problem is we can't customize it at all when we use that. So we can't do things like change the format of the enrollment date. We can't change the names. So we might want this just to say first space name. When we use auto-generate columns, we can't do any customizing. It just pulls the columns. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn auto-generate columns to false, and we're going to manually build the column, because then we can customize each one how we want to. So before my closing tag, I'm just going to go down to a new line. I'm going to say auto-generate columns equals false. If I refresh it now, I get nothing, right? So if you turn that off, the grid is basically a blank slate, and it's expecting us to manually put in whatever columns we want. We've got lots of options here. So in here, I'm now going to add a columns tag. So this indicates we're going to manually define the columns ourselves, rather than letting the auto-generate work. So when I open up a tag, we've got a whole bunch of options. The ASP bound field is the one we're going to use most. That's where it's just linked to a particular column from our query, and it will output first name or last name or student ID. We've got button fields if we want to put in a button or checkbox. Hyperlink, we can put in images. We also could put in a template field. So a template field would be, let's say we wanted to show one column and format it as last name, comma, first name. We'd create it as a template field, and we could put both of those values in separated with a comma. So we have full control over what that column would look like. In this case, we're just going to use 4 bound fields. So the first thing we set up is the data field. In this case, it'll be the student ID. And we can customize the header If we don't customize it, it's going to say student ID with no space. It's okay that there's no space in the database, but on our web application, we probably want to separate the words with space. So if I refresh the page now, we should see the student IDs. We also have the ability to hide that column. Maybe we want it to be there because we want to use the ID numbers, like for linking to an edit page, but we don't want the users to see those IDs. If we wanted to do that, we can just set visible to false. So now we get our student ID. So if we wanted to hide it, I want to show it, but we can just set visible to false, that column. Then it's still there, so we can access the values programmatically, but the end user won't see them. And sometimes we want to do that. We want to show or hide a column, right? Maybe we have read-only access for some users, and other users can change data. So maybe we want an edit or delete column that some users can see and other users can't. So we would put the column in our grid, and we could toggle the visible property depending on whether the user should be allowed to see that information, yes or no.
When the users that can't access the information, they see the table, they're just going to see it like
Well, they won't see that column. We'll do it. We'll add the other columns, and then I'll try hiding the student ID. Sam, you had a question?
Well, I was just gonna say it. So with this, if you hide the data, it will never make it to the user.
Right, but it's still there on the server.
Yeah.
So if we want to access one of those columns, even if it's hidden, we can access it in C#, but the end user doesn't see it. So let's add 2 more bound, actually let's add 3 bound fields. So the second one, the data field, is last name.
Does the data field have to match up with the column?
Yes, I'm coming to that. Thank you. You're leading right in. So if I refresh it now, I get student ID and last name. However, let's say I do this. I put in a space in the data field. I told you this a year ago, how if you did this in PHP, right, the last name values are just going to print out as blank. If we do this in .NET, now it's not case sensitive. Even though my column name is written in camel case, I could write the whole thing, for example, in all lowercase. It's Windows, it's not case sensitive. This is going to work fine in all lowercase.
like pages been loading for the past 5 minutes.
So even though in my table, even though it's camel case here, doesn't matter in my code. But if we misname it, we're going to get that error. So I'll add on the first name, and the data field has got to be first mid name, but for header text, we'll just call it first name. Yeah, so the data field has to match the column names in the database. If I save it now, I should get all my columns. So we've customized the headers, And let's say we don't want users to see student ID. If I just make that invisible, that column's hidden from the end user, but we'll still have access to the student ID values in our code if we want them. The other thing we want to do is we want to format the date. I will show the student ID, but that's how we would hide any column. So we also have a property here called the data format string. So we can apply a built-in string format for date. I think we can do it this way. I specify mm.
Shouldn't it be for Canadian day, month?
I don't know. I think that's the American is day month here. Canadian is usually the month is first.
I don't think so.
Who knows?
Mine says year, month.
Okay, not quite.
I think you have to capitalize month first.
Year, month, day.
Mine's month.
Hang on.
It's Wikipedia, I just edited it when you
Yeah.
Bear with me for a sec.
Anyone can change it. Nobody. Yeah. They can't put it in the change back and do something. Yeah.
0 colon. I just need this in front of it. I need a 0 colon in that format. I think that will fix it. There we go. So we get month, day, year with that format.
Oh, how do you format? Data format string.
Data format string 0 colon. So Ben, if you want to put the D first, by all means, format it however you like. Your project. It's Ben's world. The rest of us are just living in it.
That's right.
Can I just see the code of the student file?
Sure.
I wear spine watch.
I'm missing it. I don't remember what.
So building our grids are super easy. The only thing we ever have to change is what model are we selecting from and what's the name of our grid. But we don't have to parse out one field at a time or one record at a time anymore.
I guess grids can only do the select states.
Actually, the grids have delete and edit built in as well. They also have sorting and paging. These things are all built in. We also can access one row at a time. So for example, maybe we want to check something in each row and decide to show or hide a column or enable or disable a link. Our grid has events. It has an item created event, an item deleted, row editing. We'll actually do the delete straight from the grid. When we do the delete, we can do it right from here. So it has a lot of rich functionality. We also can even nest grids. So when we have master-child data, we could show both data within one grid. Like we can build one grid inside of another one. So it's a pretty powerful tool. We use it all the time. I mean, basically, when I build a site control panel, they're pretty much nothing but grids. So here's the data. Here's a grid view. Grid view. Grid view. Right? We're just repurposing them with links in each case. So we use them a lot. So no more need to build HTML tables. You never have to code HTML tables in your .NET apps, right? We'll let the grid do it. Yes. Applause, right?
Thank you, Microsoft.
So what I want to do above this grid, what I want to do underneath our heading but above the grid, I want to add a link to add a new student. And then we'll want to build a simple form with 3 text boxes so we can add to this list and use Entity Framework to save. Sam?
How did you have, my table spans the entire page. Is there a special class you use to make it? Mine only has a little bit.
It may have to do with where your container div is in the master page.
I'm not including student ID. What do I do that?
So in my master page, I put a class equals container around that main content.
I didn't do that, that's fine.
Doesn't matter. If you don't have it there, it's fine. So above our grid, I'm just going to put on a link that'll go to a new page. We'll call it students.aspx. So just a plain HTML link, and we'll build student, and we'll use that page for both adding and editing. The page, that form's going to be pretty similar for both, so there's really no need to create 2 separate pages for adding and editing. I know we did when we were building PHP applications. We really don't need to do it with C#. It's clean to just use 1 page for both adds and edits.
What student that is again?
Well, we're going to build that. That's going to be a form, an input form, with text boxes for last name, first name, and enrollment date. So I just want a link right here to add a new student, right? All my pages here, most of them are the same. So I've got courses, I've got an add link. Got news items with a grid and an add link. So by default in a section, we usually tend to show users what data we already have and then give them the ability to add. And then we'll add, edit, and delete links on here as well. So I'm going to go back to my Solution Explorer, right-click my project. We want to add a web form with a master page, and we're going to call the page Student. And we'll pick our master page. So we'll get a new page. I'll just put on a page title and I'll put on a heading. So this is going to be an input form. We don't have to add a form tag because our master page automatically includes one. If we go back and open up our master page, there's a built-in form with run at equals server already here. The only thing I'm going to do is I want to add a class to it. So in here, I'm going to add a class to attribute and call it form horizontal. So I'm just going to add that for formatting into my master page. The form tag's already there. We didn't add it. Visual Studio put it in there when we created the master page. So we never have to put a form tag on any of our pages. They'll just use the form tag that's on the master page instead. So I guess I'll try using a field set tag. We'll see how this format works. So I'm going to put on 3 labels, 3 text boxes, and a submit button. Well, we don't need an ASP label because we're not changing the text. That's just going to be static text. But we will want an ASP text box. We'll give it an ID of TXT last name. We'll set up the run at equals server attribute. We'll make it required. And we'll set the max length to 50 because that's how big our last name column is in the database, right? So we'll just use HTML to ensure we don't get more than 50 characters. And maybe on here I'll just put on a H5. It says all fields are required. So I'll add 2 more field sets, one for the first middle name and one for the enrollment date.
Do you do a required equals true?
It tells it wants that. In HTML5, you don't actually need that, the equals true. It's not wrong if you put it on. Now, I'm not sure whether we're going to need a .NET validator or whether we can use the text mode property to ensure we get a valid date. We'll try the text mode of date. I'm not sure whether this is going to give us all the rules we need. Well,
Server had
Time included, yeah.
yeah, but we'll ignore it. It'll just put in the default time. We don't really care about the time.
They should do
So we don't need to specify a time for the insert. We can just supply the date. We may need a compare validator or a range validator to enforce it. We'll try it this way and see.
Stop.
And then we'll put on an ASP button.
And stop.
We'll call it BTN save. I'll give it a class.
Mine now.
You can apply any button class. The BTN primary will give it a blue background. And then if I choose on-click equals, Visual Studio will allow me to create a new event handler. And we can see there's now a star beside my CS because it wrote the click event in there.
Text saves.
So I'm just going to compile that. I know you're still coding. Don't worry, I'll put the code back up. So we'll try it out. We may have to tweak the interface a little bit. Then you've got to compile it. If you added the event handler, the button's looking for the event handler, but it's not added to the DLL until you recompile. I see the yellow error screen of death, and I'm pretty sure that would be why.
Come on, Ben.
So I'll just reload,
Don't care about that.
click add. So here's our form.
Ooh, very cool.
Now, we should check the date. right? We checked. Okay, our text mode equals date isn't exactly working. So we're going to need to use a .NET validator here. Yeah.
Mine even has a little calendar tracker.
Yours has a calendar? Your enrollment date is ABC.
You use text mode equals date?
Yeah, it works.
It'll give you a little drop down on the calendar.
But I think it could be browser specific.
It might be Chrome.
Yeah, I don't think it works in Firefox.
Try it in Firefox.
I remember
It's not
reading
gonna
about
work in
that.
IE, I promise you.
I'm going to try it. I'm going to try it in Chrome.
I promise.
IE will just crash.
I will crash.
IE doesn't open for me. Ever.
So let's see if IE.
I'm going to add a .NET validator. So here's the trick, right? It works in one browser. It doesn't work in another. We know if we put a .NET validation control on it, will definitely validate as a proper date. So we may as well add one of those as a backup. If I try it in Chrome, I'm curious whether.
It works in Chrome, it doesn't work in
So it works in Chrome. Yeah, I do get the little date picker, right?
Chrome ahead in HTML5.
Chrome is loud, Chrome is loud.
Yeah, so I get the calendar. So that doesn't render in Firefox.
What about IE?
Good question. Let's try it.
It doesn't work in IE.
Doesn't work in IE?
Of course it's not gonna work.
Why'd you even ask?
I don't know, I just.
Just fine.
Yeah, so it doesn't work. It's Chrome only.
Oh god, you put it in a while.
So just to be sure, I'm going to go over to my toolbox and grab a range validator so we can specify that this field has to be a date and we can give it a minimum and a maximum. So I'm going to drag the range validator on. I'll just put it after my enrollment date. So I'll change my error message to say must be a date. And we'll need to set up some of the other properties. We'll set up the control to validate as TXT enrollment date. We're going to set up 4 or 5 other properties. Our CSS class can be alert. I can't remember. I think I will use danger. I don't know if that's red or yellow. We'll find out. Danger's red. Good.
The one you used on assignment 1, was that JavaScript? For your alerts or field validation?
Nope, these were the validators with the Bootstrap class. So the type we want to check is a date. And we're going to have to supply a minimum and a maximum. So we'll say minimum value is maybe 01/01/2000. We don't want a date before that. And our maximum can be any date far off in the future. So we just want to make sure we don't get a date outside of that range. If it's not this millennium, we're not allowing it.
What if that code's still running in the next one? If it is, that's some old like stuff.
It's been done at 5, it's 29.90.
Running on a hub right here.
So let's try it now.
This install some power for
Oh, we're going to have to add to web.config because our jQuery is throwing an error. Our JavaScript's going to throw an error.
Why does that come default?
Sorry?
So what does that come default, that configuration, the add key in web.config? Because it always throws the error as soon as you put an invalid.
That is a good question. I don't have an answer for you. Let me try again.
There's something about automating web config they don't want to do.
Oh, make value was 0101.
Yeah, so we need this unobtrusive validation mode key. So we'll go back to web.config. We'll have to create an app settings section. We can put it anywhere as long as it's inside of configuration. We'll create our app settings. And we'll add a key. We'll give it a value of none. And it's unobtrusive validation settings. So in here we need validation settings, unobtrusive validation mode. So we'll need lines 29 to 31 somewhere inside of the configuration tag, but not nested inside of any other section.
Can you just jump back to the rate validator for a second?
Yep.
So do you have to do the minimum and maximum value in a certain format?
No, I don't think it matters. We'll try it, Ben. I don't think it will matter. So we'll try it now with that setting in web.config. Yeah, now it will be triggered. So Ben asked a good question. Do we need to use this date format? I don't think so. I think I could do this, for example. I think that should still work. I'll try it.
But even like doing like day, month, year, days.
I don't think that matters. Yeah, it doesn't matter. I put the date, now I had the year first. Last time I had the year last. Right? I've got them separate. Two different date formats. It doesn't matter. So I think the last thing we'll do today is let's just wire up, let's write the code on our save button. So we'll use the entity framework, invoke our student model, we'll look at how we can insert a record, and then we'll redirect the user back to the students list, and that record should appear at the bottom of the grid. So we wrote the event handler when we created the button. So we'll use EF to connect to SQL Server. We'll use the student model to save the new record. And we'll redirect to the updated students page. So we need, I don't know, about 6 or 7 lines of code. Oops. We'll need, because we want to work with the entity framework, we're going to need the same references to our models that we had up here. So we'll need these 2 lines, linked to our models and model binding. So we'll need those 2 references in order for our page to be able to use entity framework. So the exact same lines that we have here. So now I'll create a database variable. We'll instantiate a new instance, and I'll move that curly bracket down here. So we'll create a student object. I'll just call it S. So we've got a new instance of our student model. So we'll want to set out that we'll want to populate the 3 attributes. So we'll want to populate the last name. An entity framework recognizes the types in our class. How do we get the last name? From the user interface. You got it. So we'll use txt last name dot text. We'll populate the first name property the same way from the first name box. And we'll populate the enrollment date what will we have to do here?
Person to date.
Yeah, we're going to have to use the convert function.
I used to use datetime.parse.
It will do the same thing, or you can use datetime.parse, same thing. So we're filling the properties. We're going to fill the ID that's auto-incremented in the database. So we filled the properties. And then we just take our database context, database.students.add, and we'll add in our object we've called S. So add to the existing model, add this new instance we've just created and populated. And to commit those changes to the database, we call db.savechanges. So this adds our new instance to the model, and db.savechanges actually will commit and run the insert in the SQL server. Okay, so after line 34, the new data should be in the database. And then to redirect, we can just call response.redirect. So that's a simple redirection, load another page when we're done. We do this all the time. So we'll build, we should be able to add a new student and get taken back to our students page, which should include our new record.
Rewrite to students. Right?
Yeah, back to the, oh, thank you, students. Whoops. So S is just a variable I've created to represent the new student. We could call that new student, you could call it OBJ student, whatever name is descriptive. So we've separated out from our presentation, we've separated out these business classes, and the business classes do all the database interaction for us. So I'll compile this. And I'll try and add a new student. So if I add a proper date, first and last name, the database automatically assigns the next available ID and saves good old Mr. Fubar for us.
For some reason, mine's not finding the 3 methods, or the 3
Properties?
properties, last name, first name.
Make sure you compile it. Okay, Ben, do you have these references at the top?
Yeah.
if you put the first line in and compile, do you get an error? Does it say that this, so if you add that line, do you get an error when you compile? And what do the errors say?
Does not be a definition for first name.
Okay, I will come have a look at it in a minute. So what we want to do with this, so we have create and read. Some of you probably have it working. Others are close. If you're not, I can come have a look. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to stop here for today.